Even after 200 years, the common roots of Christianity and Judaism were apparent to all. Christians and Jews shared most of the same holy days. Their religious services were parallel in many ways, with readings from the scriptures and psalms sung to Jewish music. It is perhaps remarkable that the emperors of Christian Rome did not outlaw Judaism altogether. It was tolerated, but it was put in an inferior status. Intermarriage between Christians and Jews was forbidden. Conversion to Judaism was punishable by death. Over the course of the following centuries, the imperial edicts grew harsher and the anti-Jewish laws more repressive. But the empire was in its final stages of decline. Roman border defenses were weakening. In the final decades of the 4th century, a wave of people invaded from Asia. The Hanai, they were called, the Huns. Their hordes broke upon Europe, driving other tribes before them in terror. Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and Huns ravaged the Balkans from Italy to the Black Sea. The eastern and western halves of the empire were isolated from each other. The Roman government was thrown into chaos.
For 20 years and more, the blood of Romans has been shed daily between Constantinople and the Julian Alps.
These words are from a letter written in the year 396.
Rome has to fight within her own borders, not for glory, but for bare life. Rome's army, once victor and lord of the world, now trembles with terror at the sight of the foe. The Roman world is falling.
The city of Rome itself was besieged, and in the year 410, it was sacked by the army of the Goths. There was nothing left that could be called the Roman Empire. Its eastern half withstood the onslaught and survived, but with a new identity and a new name, the Byzantine Empire. Its western half was fragmented and destroyed, broken into areas of rule that would eventually shape the map of modern Europe. In provincial towns and villages, the natives no longer looked to faraway Rome. They found whatever protection they could among themselves. They ceased to be Romans and became instead Franks, Burgundians, Britons, local peoples. The one group that stood apart in this European world were the Jews. In the few communities where they lived, they were considered Roman citizens, living with the privileges and disabilities given them by a Rome that no longer existed. A Rome whose only remaining representative was a bishop, affectionately known as the Father, the Papa, the Pope. The great dome of St. Peter's dominates the Roman sky. But for more than 1,000 years before this cathedral ever existed, the bishops of Rome were a stabilizing influence in a turbulent and chaotic age. Invaders and counter-invaders swept in waves across Italy. They came and went, but the bishops of Rome remained. Long after the Roman emperors had fled, long after the Senate had ceased to exist, long after one civil government after another had collapsed, the institution of the church remained, and with it there also remained the recollection of Rome as the capital of an empire. As in the present time, the papacy had a great symbolic influence. By this I mean a capacity to exercise authority without coercive power. But from 590 onward, the influence of the papacy became much more than symbolic. It became tangible, it became political, it became temporal, because 590 was the date of the consecration of the great Pope, Gregory the Great, Gregory the First. Gregory came to power as the last vestige of Roman rule slipped away in the West. The bishops of far-off Constantinople could no longer enforce their will in Europe. Theirs became the Eastern Orthodox faith. In the West, Gregory guided the bishops of Christian Europe and helped to shape a Catholic Church based in Rome. This was to be the central institution of European life, keeping alive the remnants of Roman knowledge and culture in a time that would come to be known as the Middle Ages. In the east, near the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, life continued, unaffected by the disasters that had struck imperial Rome. While Rome struggled against wave upon wave of invasions, the Persian Empire reached a golden age of art and culture. Near the ancient city of Babylon was the major center of Jewish life in this day. 500,000 Jews maintained a presence, begun more than 1,000 years before. Here, the descendants of the Jews deported by Nebuchadnezzar had established major centers of learning and rabbinic study. The Jews of Babylonia shared in this rich culture, and they flourished. In the Babylonian academies of Jewish learning, rabbis discussed and analyzed the ancient texts of their people. They studied the Torah and the Mishnah. Over the centuries, the discussions of the rabbis were remembered and passed on to later generations of students. In Galilee, other academies of scholars carried on a similar process. What resulted was a body of literature like no other ever produced. The scholars in Galilee and Babylon created a monumental source of Jewish culture known as the Talmud. They wrote commentaries on the Bible, and then commentaries on the commentaries, and then they commented on all of that. And thus they produced a rich, copious, voluble, chaotic, but vivid body of writing containing literature, legend, and law. A page of the Talmud in Hebrew and Aramaic goes on and on forever, without any periods or commas or points of punctuation. The Talmud cannot be read, it has to be studied, it has to be learned. Study, learning, that is what the word Talmud means. In form, the Talmud is a discussion of the Mishnah, which was produced in Galilee. At the center is a passage from the Mishnah. Surrounding it is a running dialogue of the rabbis' remarks and their arguments, along with stories, legends, and miscellaneous teachings. There are precise legal discussions of ceremonial, civic, and moral duties. There are maxims, popular proverbs, prayers, parables, and fables of Jewish and heathen folklore. It is a storehouse of information on law, history, medicine, and astronomy, on science and magic, on commerce and agriculture. This very original and unsystematic way of teaching was described by one of the rabbis in a commentary on Genesis, Bereshit Rabbah. I quote, "It is all like an impenetrable thicket of reeds. What does the clever man do? He cuts a path and enters, and then he cuts more reeds and penetrates further. In the end, he has made a clearing, and others begin to enter by following his path." The Talmud became an entire culture in itself. And although one group of Jews, the Karaites, rejected its authority, for Orthodox Jews everywhere, it became the central theme of life and thought unto this very day. In the course of time, the study of the Talmud became consecrated as an act of virtue, a symbol of devotion to God. The world of the Jews had grown by dispersion. Their communities extended from Persia to Morocco and Spain, from Central Europe to the Sahara. Their central idea had triumphed, the idea of the unity of God, and therefore the coherence of nature and of human destiny. That idea lived on in their biblical texts and Talmudic writings, and through Christianity, it had become the normative principle of the Mediterranean world. So Christians and Jews were in antagonism, but between Judaism and Christianity, there was a deep underlying consensus about the purpose and direction of human destiny. That consensus was now to be enlarged. A vigorous, militant assertion of it would spring out of the blazing desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula. Arabia. This arid land extended eastward beyond the reach of empires. Across its wastes, caravans passed, carrying goods from India and Africa to the settled lands of the Mediterranean. Its tribal people combined the worship of their ancient deities with elements of Judaism and Christianity. At the beginning of the 7th century, in the city of Mecca in Arabia, a merchant named Muhammad had a vision. In it, the angel Gabriel commanded him to spread word of the one God to all the Arab peoples. In the streets and markets of Mecca, he called upon his listeners to submit utterly to the will of God. Islam, the new religion, would be called, literally, the submission. His preachings were rejected violently in Mecca, and after escaping a plot on his life in the year 622, he fled to the city of Medina. Muhammad was not a man to be easily thwarted. He collected an army of 10,000 men and marched to Mecca, which he conquered. What now happened was almost beyond belief. The armies of Muhammad and of his successors, the Khulafa as they were called, the caliphs, captured one after the other Damascus, Jerusalem, Egypt, Baghdad, Persia. The armies of Islam fought their way to the gates of Byzantium before being stopped. Throughout Asia Minor, Christian communities fled before the invincible sword of Islam. The mountains of Cappadocia in modern Turkey still bear scars inflicted in that day. Here, Christian refugees carved homes for themselves out of the raw rock of remote cliffsides. Christianity, once the official religion of the entire Mediterranean, was forced into retreat. Here, in a final hiding place, people of what had been the Eastern Roman Empire found holy solace in the darkness of their caves. A portion of the Byzantine Empire would survive for centuries to come, but it had lost forever its sway over the southern and eastern Mediterranean. The age that was now dawning would be known as the Arab Age. By the early 8th century, 100 years after the death of Muhammad, his faith, Islam, dominated vast areas from India all the way to Spain. Across the transformed lands of Syria, Arabia, Egypt, and Persia, the successors of Muhammad sought to unite all men in a single community of Islam. There was to be no priesthood, no hierarchy, no central capital. The mosque, the place of worship, was to serve as the one gathering point for all men. The adherents of this new faith would now scale great heights in literature, philosophy, art, architecture, and mathematics. It is said that throughout his lifetime, Muhammad spoke to his followers while in states of divine inspiration. The words that he uttered were written down. Eventually, they would be collected into a single volume. It would be known as the Quran, the sacred scriptures of Islam.
Come to prayer. Come to prayer. There is no God but the God. There are 5 duties: prayer, almsgiving, fasting, the declaration of faith, and the pilgrimage to Mecca.
They are the 5 pillars of Islam. 5 times a day, the faithful turn towards Mecca, responding to the summons of the muezzin. La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasulullah. There is no God but the God, and Muhammad is his messenger. By this central declaration of faith, the Muslim accepted all of the teachings of Muhammad and swore allegiance to the community of Islam. It is written in the Quran,
We believe in God, and in that which has been sent down to us and sent down to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and Jacob, and to the tribes, and that which was given to Moses and Jesus and the prophets of their Lord. We make no division between any of them, and to him we surrender.
By the 8th century, 9 out of 10 Jews lived in the Islamic world. Jewish communities from Persia in the east, across North Africa to Spain in the west, were linked by this international culture. A new age was about to begin for the Jews of Arab lands. With the conflict between Islam and the Byzantine Empire, Christian trade routes through Muslim lands were abandoned. Until this time, the Jews had been known primarily as craftsmen, metal workers, jewelers, dyers. Now Jewish merchants gained prominence. It was they who took over the trade routes that the Christians left behind. Jewish merchants were the only ones permitted to travel freely in both Islamic and Christian lands. More and more they dealt in goods in cities that flourished along the caravan routes of North Africa and the Near East. Already there were Jewish settlements in countries ringing the Mediterranean. Merchants traveling between them relied upon these communities for assistance and support. The Jews of these communities benefited in turn from the trade the merchants brought them. Step by step, working with their kinsmen, they established commercial ties between East and West, creating an international trade that linked the expanding territory of Islam with parts of the world as distant as England, India, and China. Never before had Jews found themselves in such a position. The effects of their new prosperity and prominence were to be far-reaching. In the land of Spain, now under Islamic rule, Jews joined enthusiastically with Muslims in developing what would become one of the great ages of Jewish and Islamic life. Jews would share in the government, the scholarship, the arts and sciences of this new world. To the north, Christian Europe was about to burst forth with creative energy, drawing upon the resources and scholarship of Jews from Mediterranean lands. A new chapter of history for the Jews and for all the world was about to unfold, a chapter to be written on the continent of Europe. "800 years before, the Jews had seen their land destroyed, but they themselves had persevered. They had endured because their sense of purpose as a people remained undimmed. They had adapted to life without a land of their own, and they had preserved their customs as an act of devotion to the one God, the God whose covenant in Sinai they still remembered, the God whose nature they still proclaimed to all the world." 800 years had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They had witnessed the changing fortunes of individual men and of entire peoples. But throughout this period, one thing had survived and advanced with inevitable force: the belief in one God and in a moral law that applied to all mankind. Starting as the unique concept of the Jewish people, it had come to be accepted in varying forms by most peoples throughout the Mediterranean region. The paradox was that although Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were united by profound ethical and spiritual convictions, these three great religions remained in competition, sometimes in bitter competition, as the brilliant and troubled times of the Middle Ages would soon demonstrate.